YouTube rolls out something new, the latest from our free daily newsletter at podnews.net. YouTube's podcast tab, which we reported on Monday, appears to have globally rolled out, as promised, in its apps on both iOS and Android. We'll link to what it looks like today in our show notes and our newsletter at podnews.net. Meanwhile, Headliner has now generated more than 1.7 million full episode audiograms to places like YouTube. The company produces audiograms including automated uploading. Podtrac's ranker is out for March. iHeart Podcasts is still number one for podcasts, though total downloads are down 8.3%. Wondery at number 2 is up 8.1%, and NPR at number 3 is up 9.3% month on month, although March has 10% more days in it than February, calendar fans. The highest new entry in Podtrac's top podcast list for US audiences is the Murdoch Murders podcast from Luna Shark at number 16. Podtrac measures participating publishers only and doesn't measure either Spotify's podcast studios nor SiriusXM. Vividata has released the Spring 2023 SCC study of the Canadian consumer. The data claims 29% of Canadians, 8.9 million of them, listen to podcasts every week. That's up from 22% in 2021. And listeners spend nearly an hour listening to podcasts per day. 29% sounds a lot, but for Canadian radio, well, that reaches 78% of Canadians, and they listen twice as much. Comedy podcast network Starburns Audio has closed, reports Ashley Carman in her newsletter Soundbite. A significant drop in advertising revenue was to blame. And the IAB has announced the agenda for the 2023 IAB podcast Upfront. It's on May the 11th in New York and virtual. In People News, Gavin Gaddis has been promoted to Head of Content at Sounds Profitable. They've worked for the company since February 2022. And in podcast news, after winning many awards as a radio series on the BBC World Service until 2019, Catherine Carr's Where Are You Going is back with creators Loftus Media for a new season of the show with a simple premise, asking people one question and seeing where it goes. Catherine explained how the show works in 2019 in a short 10-minute presentation in London's Next Radio, which we'll link to today. The Podnews Weekly Review this week has interviews with Acast's Lizzie Pollett and the Birmingham Podcast Festival's Nina Robinson, as well as a look into the week's podcast news. From Glassbox Media, Mega launches this Sunday a satirical and humorous take on religious critique for both believers and non-believers. If you enjoyed the original series of The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, should be a perfect listen. The hosts of The Book Case, Kate and Charlie Gibson, were live on Good Morning America yesterday, talking about their latest season and how this week they're exploring the business boom of audiobooks. There's a new podcast in Dutch, which I'm not going to try and pronounce, but it's called Through the Eyes of the King. It's a 10-episode podcast on Acast that looks back at King Willem-Alexander's 10 years on the throne of the Netherlands. And if the podcasts we mention here have trailers, then New Podcast Trailers is where to find them, updated every day with new and interesting shows to listen to. If you've got a long weekend this weekend, snuggle down with a new podcast. You never know, you might find a new favourite. You'll find New Podcast Trailers wherever you found this podcast. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.